along Thai-Lao borderland. So that's for me personally. So a little bit of background about our speaker today. So Professor Miriam Stark is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Hawaii and Manoa. She has held administrative roles in national and international disciplinary organizations, including the Society for American Archaeology, the Archaeological Institute of America, and Indo-Pacific Prehistory Association. Professor Stark has received numerous grants from organizations such as the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for Humanities, the National Geographic Society, NASA Space Archaeology Program, and the Luz Foundation. She has conducted field-based research across Cambodia and currently directs the University of Hawaii and Manoa's Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Professor Stark also serves on the Cultural Property Advisory Committee for the U.S. State Department. Her archaeological research focuses on the political economy of ancient states. Her archaeological projects blend research with capacity building for Khmer archaeologists and include heritage management in their long-term research design. One of the most recent publications of hers is a co-edited collaboration with Mish Hendrickson and Damien Evans, entitled The Angkorian World, published in 2023. So please welcome Professor Miriam Stark.
Thank you very much, Dick, if I can use your nickname, and thank you to the Center for Khmer Studies for inviting me to speak. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be talking both with so many students, young scholars, and also some very old friends. So I'm really glad to be here, but I must start by warning you that this is not really just an archaeology lecture. So for the archaeologists who showed up, there is archaeology, but at the core of my talk is a focus on the Mekong as a region and on the importance of trying to look at the past, the future, and the present as one continuous period of time in the history of a region who is much older than any of us in this room. So I developed this talk primarily, I guess, because I've been working in Cambodia since 1996. And I did work in Thailand, although it wasn't on the Mekong before, it was central Thailand. But I spent a lot of time in the Mekong Basin and a lot of thought about its future and also its history. And one of the points I think that's been made clear to me, is that you can't separate out one piece of the Mekong Basin from another, and that everything we talk about as the lower Mekong is so intimately tied that it's important to think about it both as a region that has some kind of salience and also as a region that has a very deep history. And as an archaeologist, of course, what I really study is history. All right, next, please. So to give you a little framework for how I will give this talk, I will start by talking a little bit about the anatomy of the Mekong River. I guess this would be called physical geography. Then I will talk specifically about the Mekong Basin as a biophysical region, coming back to the idea that while you could grow up in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, or Vietnam, you're part of the same broad area. And we know that archaeologically going back at least 3,000 years, because we know people have been moving along the Mekong for at least that long. Then I'll talk about recent history in a very superficial way for the historian in the front row, and talk about the 20th and post-20th century Mekong. Okay, so that frames my study. Next. And then I will focus on two areas of the Mekong, and recognizing that I can't talk about the entire Mekong Basin. So I'll only talk about two areas where I have some personal experience running archaeological projects. The first is the Mekong Delta, which for the archaeologists here, they know that I worked down in Takeo province for quite a long time. And I got lured up to the Tony Stop for various reasons, and also worked around the Angkor. Although now we're working in Battambang. In fact, this morning just came back from Battambang, but it's still part of the Mekong Basin. and the Tonle Sap. Next, please. So I'll talk about turning points. I will not give you an entire history. I will not give you radiocarbon dates. I will talk about points which we think of as inflection points, turning points, I call them, when things seem to change. And I'll take 3 of those, starting at the first millennium BCE, the second at the first millennium CE, and then take us up to the present. Next, please. So if there are lessons from the past, I will ask for help from some of our ancestors at the end. Next, please. So we need to understand the Mekong River and the Mekong Basin has an origin, and its origin is far to the north of us. As best as we know, on the Tibetan Plateau, there is literally a point, according to geographers, where the Mekong starts. And if you look in the upper left-hand image, you can see a red line with A, D, and something, maybe S. But if you look at the second picture down, it's that area that geographers swear the Mekong begins. And in fact, perhaps it begins right there where the water is coming down. And you can see the river down here coming up the Tibetan Plateau. So the red box there shows you that the Mekong has an origin place. And it has many different forms it takes. But you can't ever forget that the Mekong is one of these very long rivers. There are several of them that originate in the Tibetan highlands, and they shape much of what we think of as monsoon Asia. Next, please. We'll be talking not so much about Tibet, but the point here is just to show in this convoluted image that you can look from the top on the left to the bottom on the right and go from China to Vietnam. I go through many different countries that are touched by the Mekong. Next. So if you start at the top, I'm not going to pronounce Tibetan language. I can barely pronounce English. But you can see that it has a specific name, 2 names, before it even leaves China. And then if you go to the next slide, then you see that the Mekong, as a river that we know, takes on names that are more familiar to us, whether it's the Mae Nam Pong or the Mae Nam Pong, and forgive my pronunciations, or next slide, here in Cambodia, the Mekong, and then the next slide, the Song Mekong, with more mouths than occurred by nature for various reasons. Right? So this is the same river. It just has different names in different places, and it takes different forms. But once you see it, next please, in the middle Mekong into the lower Mekong, this is the area of impact that we feel in Cambodia. Next please. So I have to show you the Mekong Delta because Angkor Barai is on this image. But just to show you, the Mekong Delta actually originates just south of Phnom Penh. Many researchers working in Vietnam only focus on the Vietnamese piece of the Delta, but it actually originates up in southern Cambodia, and we'll be talking about it. And so I like this map. It's very rare in the scholarly literature for showing where the Mekong Delta begins. Next, please. And we will start in the Delta because it's an area I know something about. Deltas aren't always triangular, but they're always a little bit in that shape, which is why the name Delta is used based on the Greek letter Delta. I don't know if that matters, but I just learned that recently. Okay, so you can see this Landsat. Next, please. And these are just images of the Mekong Delta in Cambodia, where I've worked largely. People live along the rivers, they live along drainages, but even if they live away from the drainages, almost everything they do is connected to the river and to these tributaries. Because these are transportation routes, because of flooding, which dictates the annual cycle, and many of the people still in southern Cambodia are farmers. And so the Mekong Delta and the flow of the Mekong affects their annual farming cycle. Next, please. These are pictures specifically from the area around Angkor Barai in Takeo province, where we ran a project for 1996, started in 1995. I began my project in 1996 until 2009. We're still analyzing data. In fact, we have a PhD student from University of Oregon who's heading down now to Phnom Penh to work on animal bones from our excavations. But it's a very wet place part of the year, and it's a very dry place the other part of the year. And it's this seasonality, it's very pronounced dry season and this very predictable rainy season, which has dictated life in southern Cambodia and part of the Mekong Delta for thousands of years. And we think archaeologically that it was not until farmers learned how to live with the water and the flooding that this area was settled in any extensive way. And we think that primarily from the results from the Lower Mekong Archaeological Project and survey work we've been doing. Next, please. So this lower Mekong Basin is a very important place in the Mekong catchment. If you want to think about Cambodia today, where we are, this is in the lower Mekong Basin. Next, please. But you can also look at another piece of the basin, which is very important. It's like an artery of the Mekong, which is the Tonle Sap River. This is more physical geography. And you know this already. You know that you have the Mekong coming down on the east, but you have this Tonle Sap River and Tonle Sap Lake here, and that's where we live right now. Next, please. So on the lake, most of you have probably visited some of the communities on the Tonle Sap Lake. There are floating communities, used to be floating villages, and many people benefit. These pictures are from about 10 or 15 years ago when the fish yields were much higher than they are now. We'll get back to that. Next, please. And as you know, until quite recently, there was this flood pulse, which was also very predictable in this region, where during the rainy season, you would have a quintupling of the size of the Tonle Sap Lake. It would get 5 times as big. You can see it on this particular Landsat map, because the Tonle Sap Lake down here in October is dark, and it's much bigger than the Tonle Sap Lake in the upper picture, which is in June. So this is the pattern that allowed people to settle also around Angkor and all the way around the Tonle Sap Lake. We have been working a series of different archaeology teams in multiple places around the Tonle Sap, and what we find is a very consistent pattern, which is that just like in the Mekong Delta, as soon as farmers learned how to farm with the floods, they came in. Now, according to French geographers, even by the 1960s, canal-based irrigation was not a common form of irrigation in Cambodia. It was in Vietnam, but not in Cambodia. But flood recession rice and floating rice agriculture were two very productive means of farming besides rain-fed agriculture. And you can do that when you have a flood pulse. You can do that when you have regular floods in the Mekong Delta. Next, please. So hydroclimate matters, and you don't need to know what this picture says, except that you have a flood pulse hydrology, you have the reversal of the Tonle Sap River, it pushes more water into this basin, you have the regular flooding of the Mekong Delta, and all of this created a relatively stable kind of setting for farmers for several thousand years. Next, please. But this relative stability at the meta level of the basin has been interrupted quite a bit, and this has happened in the 20th and the post-20th century. And so this is a turning point, and we're going to work backwards in time and then come back up in time. So next, please. And what we see, and this is where I'm not talking archaeology, is that we have this confluence of factors that are upsetting that kind of fundamental resilience you have in the lower Mekong Basin system. You have climate change, which everyone finally agrees is happening. You have the drive for hydropower, for energy, for all kinds of reasons by different actors in many different countries. And you have impact on livelihood and security. Oh, sure. And so you can see it at this regional level, which for me is the basin. Or the Mekong. You can see it at the national level, and you can see it specifically in the Tonle Sap and Mekong Delta. Next, please. And there's big impact, right? So this combination, which we'll get to, of dams and climate change, could lead to really very big changes across the entire basin. So I have a series of projections here. Sorry, but archaeologists love big science. And so I have a series of projections here, which haven't changed substantially in the last 6 years. I was just checking a 2024 report which are trying to understand, based on recent data, what the mean daily temperatures will look like in the Mekong Basin and also precipitation through time. So I'm going to run you through 3 or 4 different slides showing what it's like now, or what it was like 40 years ago, 1980, versus what it might be like in another 30 or 40 years. So one difference is that it's getting hotter. Like, we know that. This is incontrovertible. And if you look on the left, 2070, maybe it's going to be very hot, which is red. And you can see that most of the Mekong Basin has changed color. Most of it has become bright red. Okay, next please. So you can look at the heat, but heat is only one factor in looking at the climate, and another one is droughts. Now, this is monsoon Asia, so we understand and live with annual droughts and annual floods. But there's a difference between an annual flood drought cycle and floods that are too floody, that have too much water, and droughts that are too long, right? So farmers have calibrated their farming, until recently, until the 70s, they really calibrated their farming of rice to accommodate flood regimes that included rice that would grow at as many as 20 different amounts of time based on floods and the recession of water. So droughts really matter. And everyone, all these models suggest that the droughts will increase by 2050, which makes it harder for farmers. Next please. Flooding will get worse. So you can have flooding, which is predictable, although flooding is already intensifying. But the predictions are that certain areas will get so much flooding, specifically, I was just reading about Spiraean and Khmer province, that it will make farming untenable in some regions. Next, please. So there are pockets of vulnerability. So all through the Mekong Basin, there are areas that will be more affected. And while it's true that the circles here from USAID do not mostly include Cambodia, again, I have to emphasize that you can't just extract Cambodia out of the Mekong Basin. It's one large integrated geographical region. Next, please. And then there's what we're doing, right? So there's climate change. And I'm not a climate scientist, although I work with them. But there's also the dams we're putting in. And the dams are having a big impact. On the one hand, people in The Guardian are saying it's going to kill the Mekong. Next, please. But it is definitely the case that as different scientists and policy centers are tracking the Mekong, they can already see changes. They can see reductions in fish yields. They can see a reduction in the sediment load of the Mekong coming down, which on the one hand causes problems because the natural fertility is decreasing in the farmlands that used to benefit from that. On the other hand, I'll show you what happens next. The other thing that happens is if you don't have the same kind of stream flow coming down, river flow coming down with the sediment loads, then the saltwater intrusion comes up the Mekong. And so what's happened in a lot of the Mekong Delta in Vietnam is that there's so much salt now that people can't farm rice. And so they've moved to shrimp aquaculture. But even shrimp aquaculture, it turns out, is only a short-term solution, right? So people are trying workarounds. Humans are very resourceful. But it's not good. So you have global warming, which is leading to rising sea levels. So you already have more of an influx of delta drowning, saltwater intrusion, and you have lower sedimentation. Next, which if you look at it, causes this sort of thing, right? So I put in this Ben Tre province to show you the guy with the bucket on his head, but to show you the problem that's happening is that as you have increased frequency of droughts, as they're getting longer, you have lower water levels, and you have coastal erosion, you have fewer fish, there's a lot of out-migration. And the first place we're seeing this is in Vietnam, right? So I know it's not Cambodia, but we're all part of the same system. Next, please. And during a 10-year period, from 2008 to 2018, at least 1.7 million farmers had to leave Vietnam's Mekong Delta because they couldn't farm there anymore. Yes, there is this kind of rural to urban migration happening, but when farmers are interviewed, they have to stop. That also, the aquaculture is coming in, but small farmers can't sustain themselves on aquaculture, and they're selling out to large factories that are starting to do industrial level aquaculture. I'm not trying to depress you, I'm just telling you these things are happening. And you can see the salinity, so where it's very brown, it's very salty. The soil is too salty. And to give you an example of how bad that can be for farmers, one of the most ancient civilizations in the world was Mesopotamia. And archaeologists uniformly agree now that the reason why you have a change, you have a northern movement of the Mesopotamian civilization and an abandonment of the southern Mesopotamia area where the earliest cities in the world came up is because of salt, right? It's salinization, and you have it now, right? So this is a very long-term problem. We know from Mesopotamia it can continue for thousands of years, so it's not something that's easily reversible. Next, please. So we have a human footprint in the Mekong Basin, and the footprint is getting bigger and bigger. And my question is, how did we get here? Next. So there are turning points in managing the Mekong and living with the Mekong that humans have experienced. Next, please. Because I'm an archaeologist, we'll start with prehistory. Sorry, bear with me. But this is the period we associate with the Neolithic to the Metal Age. So this is about 3000 BCE, about 5,000 years ago until about 1500 years ago. And this is a very important period of time we don't know very much about. However, in Cambodia, many Cambodian archaeologists have worked on projects on this period of time, which we call prehistory. And I have just examples of things we found. It's true that that particular Domsong drum was not found in Cambodia, but Domsong drums have been found in Cambodia. And this is an excavation in Kampong Cham through the Royal University of Fine Arts, and sustained work has been done there and several other places. Okay, next. The period of time I'm most familiar with is often called proto-history. It's really not the Iron Age in Cambodia because we have writing. But it's the period of time somewhere around 500 BCE, so 2,500 years ago to 1,500 years ago. And this was a very important period both for northwest Cambodia, which you'll hear about, but not so much for this area here. It was good, but it was extremely important for southern Cambodia. And particularly because it's associated with the earliest documented so-called kingdom that the Chinese called Funan. Next. The archaeologists knew I would get here because this is what I worked on for years and years. And just to be clear, whatever the kingdom of Funan was, which the Chinese visited, emissaries in the 3rd century and in the 6th century talked about the kingdom of Funan. Later, inscriptions call back to a period of Funan as well, by named rulers. Whatever it was in most of the delta. Now, Angkor Parai, where we worked, has the earliest dated Khmer inscription. I won't show you, but it's from AD 611. But in fact, Vietnamese archaeologists have also been working at these sites, which they call archaeoculture sites. And what we have is a network of communities throughout the entire Mekong Delta. They didn't have a Cambodia and a Vietnam. They just had that place. And to give you an idea of how old it was, we excavate very early deposits, but these two wooden Buddhas, which were actually found, I think, in the 1940s, have been radiocarbon the 5th century. In Vinh Dinh and in Gotap. Gotap was it was one of the larger centers, not as big as Angkor Parai. It was a very big center then. So what we have at this point is the first evidence in Cambodia, or in the Mekong Basin, of urbanism, with large sites, not so many, but enough, that the Chinese described, institutionalized religion, and a kind of level of social stratification that one generally associates with ancient states. Chinese call Funan a kingdom. It doesn't matter what term you use, but this is all before Angkor. And it's before Angkor by hundreds of years. Next, please. I did want to point out that sometimes archaeologists find gold. I did not find that gold. And it's not only at Angkor Parai. In fact, I think I don't have pictures of Angkor Parai. We'll see. But this is another excavation that was run. It was a German-Cambodian excavation that was run in Pre-Angkorian province, just to show you that it wasn't only in Takayom. You can go to many different places and you'll find this. Right? Cambodia was very important in this way. And I also wanted to point out that's gold, of course. Of course, it's pottery. If you look at the beads here on the right, my colleague and co-director for Pre-Angkorian Cambodia, Alison Carter, has done a lot of work with a colleague at Chicago Field Museum. to study the beads and where they're from. And we have very clear evidence, we think, that there were beads coming into the delta and throughout the Mekong Basin. The glass beads were some were from South Asia. We have some that have Chinese recipes. And we also have circulation of stone beads all over the region. So we have networks that are developing. There's the Mekong Delta. There's a network going all the way up the Mekong into what we think of now as Laos and Thailand. Next, please. Okay, I have one picture. This is for some of our work that we did around Angkor Varai, not the site itself. Maybe I'll show that next. But this is to show the connectedness. Oh, here's Angkor Varai from Google. Just a 300-hectare walled site. That's not the extent of Angkor Varai, but that's kind of big. And it's definitely very big for its period of time in mainland Southeast Asia. There's nothing like that in Southeast Asia. What's interesting isn't just the burials we dug, but we tested canals to try to figure out the age of the canals that had first been identified by French functionaries, I think flying over them in the 30s. And you can see the canals on the left here. What you can see is that there are canals from Angkor Varai, where you see the box, all the way down to Akayo, which Louis Mallory excavated in the 1940s. So again, another indication that these communities were networked. They were involved with each other. Objects moved from place to place, and so we think did people. I shouldn't mention this, but we did actually have genetic information that came back from one of our excavated skeletons at Angkor Varai. I think it was we reported it last year or the year before. 40% South Asian. There were people. This area was involved in. It wasn't colonized by South Asians, but it was involved in this Indian Ocean maritime silk trade, especially through the Bay of Bengal. Next, please. Okay, so that was the proto-history. So then you see by then that you have networks within the Mekong Basin and networks that connect the Mekong Basin to the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. Now the period of time you probably know a little bit about because you're here at Angkor, well sorry, it's History of this, I should call it. I think it is big in the Angkor Center, is the Pre-Angkorian and the Angkorian period. After Funan, right? And so during the Pre-Angkorian period, next please, we have at least very clear evidence not only of an art tradition. South Asian historians say we know who they are, and that's not how we make them in South Asia. These are very uniquely Southeast Asian. And we have shrines. Again, they say, I mean, we've looked, there's architecture that bears a little bit of similarity. Certainly they use brick in South India, but it doesn't look like this. And we have the emergence of this one primate center, Sambor Breakhook, which is a World Heritage Site in Kampong Thom. Again, it's along the Mekong. Next, please. So Pre-Angkorian settlement was really based on the Mekong and its tributaries. And if you look in the upper right here, you can see 3 ellipses. The one on the bottom is because during this period, the Mekong Delta was very important. The art tradition seems to emanate out of there. It's very beautiful statues. And then we also have to the west or up to the north would be the Angkor area, so the Tonle Sap Plain. And then we have another very interesting and extremely important network developing that's literally along the Mekong up to Stom Train and Kratia. All of these are interacting with each other, but they have distinct stylistic traditions, and we have inscriptions talking about relationships between them. So this is by the 8th century CE. Next, please. All of this is to say that before we have Angkor, we have all of that. We have no clear evidence of canal-based irrigation. We have evidence of complex polities. We have kingdoms. We have maybe second-generation kingdoms. Perhaps we have the queens of Kratia, I don't know, but we have all kinds of named rulers, and we have very interconnected systems along the Mekong. And then you get to the Angkorian period. Next, please. And this is the period that you probably know most about because of where we're living. This is an old picture, but I like it because of the monks. Next, please. But what you might not know, because archaeologists do this kind of work, is that whether we look at architecture, we look at inscriptions, we look at pottery, or we look at pollen, we see interconnectedness. So Angkor is at the center there, but you can go all the way to southern Laos, the Wat Phu, and you can go all the way to northeast Thailand, beyond Phnom Penh, Pi Mai, and even maybe to western Thailand, and to places further south and into Vietnam that are not on this map. And you can see connectedness. Always, it's an interconnected area. It's not Cambodia versus Vietnam. None of that really matters. And this, of course, all the way down to the Mekong. And I would say that that women had quite a bit of agency, particularly with us, particularly with decisions that were made about where we were and weren't allowed to work. But I can't speak to it more about it.
Good evening, Professor Stark. Thank you very kindly for your overview and first time of the history of archaeology, ethnography, the region, the economies, and freedom. I'm a teacher here. I'd like to know, you mentioned the Khmers and his position of conflict. You mentioned the Khmers, Frenchman in his position of Congo as a hydraulic state, and you also mentioned Mesopotamia and the cause of the abandonment of population due to desalinization.
Yeah.
What is your position when people talk about the rise and fall, especially the abandonment of Angkor? What are some theories or ideas? And is one kind of stronger than the other?
For the rise and for the fall. At least this is in my wheelhouse. At least it's not about soils or gender. What we always say is we're in the middle of studying this. So, you can talk, if you only use documentary data and you use inscriptions and Chinese documentary accounts, you get one story. Archaeologists, we try to do it from being on the ground. We try to look at proxies for increasing evidence of centralization and so on. I wouldn't say that there's one reason there isn't one reason that caused the rise of Angkor or that caused the collapse of Angkor. But, and here I actually have to give credit to a geographer who worked years and years ago, who was suggesting that you would only have early states in certain parts of mainland Southeast Asia because you need to have certain kinds of hydrological conditions that would allow people to do it. His name was Van Leer, and he was an engineer who worked doing development work for years, I think mostly in Thailand. And he and a guy named Ronald Ames said by 1979, they said you could only have the rise of states where you could generate surplus without intensified agriculture. And one of the areas they identified was the Tonle Sap because of its hydrological regime. So, why do we have that shift to social stratification? Archaeologists always fall back on surplus. So through time, the ability to generate surplus agriculturally, in Mesopotamia, people say it was trade. Here we would say generally it was surplus, that because it was possible to grow so much rice, some people didn't have to be farmers and they could specialize in other fields. And as that happened, you had the development of political specialists as well, and you have social stratification because some people get more surplus than the others. You don't have to be Marxist. I don't think all archaeologists consider themselves Marxists, but that notion that surplus lies at the core is really key because otherwise you couldn't feed a city like Angkor. So archaeologists often try to study how do you feed cities, whether it was Rome, and Rome's expansion into North Africa because it needed more grain, particularly in Carthage. Right, you have these records of them shipping vast ships full of food to Rome. Right, so surplus is at the key of at the core of understanding how a complex society can be that complex, at least for us. So just generally, I would say again, maybe it sounds environmentally determinist, but I would say that it has to do with the fact that people could grow so much rice. And why it collapsed, I don't think of it as collapsing. Well, sorry. I have written about it as collapse and regeneration. Different places will rise and collapse, but the civilization never collapsed, right? From 611 CE AD, where you have the first Khmer writing, you have Khmers, and Khmers continue, but they move around the landscape, and they move to different places for different reasons. So is that really a collapse of Angkor? When you see these kinds of through lines, we think of it more as cycling, where we have certain areas that become very important at certain points in time. So I prefer not to use the word even collapsing. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dara, archaeology student in Cambodia. My question, the first question relates to the archaeology. You already talk about the holy water that flow from the blue land of last year and go to the lake across the Congo, something like that. It is the idea of the holy water. Do you see this idea continue in the middle period or in the Pre-Angkorian period? See something like that, this idea continue or in the middle period or we used to see in the pre-Angkorian period. And another question relates to the everyday Mekong system, river system. We're talking about the Cambodia will take a new canal from the one part of the Mekong river system to the sea. I want to know about your idea, your perspective related to this new canal. I think that it's not a new canal in Cambodia or in the south of Cambodia or in the south of Vietnam, because in the past in Pre-Angkorian something, we already see the canal, something like that in the south of Cambodia or Vietnam. Well, thank you.
So I'll talk about Funan Teco Canal after this. Let me start by saying that in the Pre-Angkorian period, we have very large Lena, in the plural, right? So I can't tell you that water was sacred, for sure, but I can tell you that we have Lena. For example, when we were surveying in 1997, before most of you were born, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, we went to this one community called Homyo. It doesn't much matter, but there was a Lena, and it's like, it was 1.5 meters. It was really big, just lying there on the ground. Now it's at the Angkor Museum. When I see Lena, I am willing to conclude that there were water or there were fluid rituals. And I, as an archaeologist who's a little bit brash, would say that there could be sacred water. But I understand that I'm saying that as an inference. I can't tell you there's sacred water. There are not inscriptions that talk about it at that time. That's number one. And for the post-Angkorian period, very hard for us to know. First of all, it's very hard to do post-Angkorian archaeology. I have great respect for my colleagues. In fact, we went to Battambang to do post-Angkorian archaeology, and it's so thin. That layer is so thin. We went back to what we know best, which is Pre-Angkorian, Angkorian. So, no, we don't know for the post-Angkorian period. I can't say that. Now, as for the Funan Teco Canal, what I can tell you is that during the Funan period, people were traveling along rivers, and the canals we tested were broad enough that we think they would have been used for communication, not for irrigation. I guess I should have said that earlier. They're very broad canals. And I think it would be probably discreet for me to leave it there, except what are my ideas? People were traveling in that area using some canals and rivers before, and they might again have visited them.
Hello again. Thank you for your time. This time I will not ask about story.
Wait, storage?
I want to ask you about you. When we think about Cambodia and Cambodia history, we think about Angkor and great civilization of Angkor and great monuments. But you mentioned about the common people at those time along the Mekong River, and I wanted to know how archaeology can document about those people that are not elites.
Do you read our work? I think maybe I paid her to ask that. The work that we've been doing, and Chairachna is here in the audience right now, the work we've been doing since 2010, both in the Angkor area and now in Battambang, is precisely about the people, not the rulers, sorry, and not about the temples. We're very interested in trying to understand daily lives of people and households of people. In fact, the project I just came back from this morning, Archaeology, is about trying to understand households in the past, in the Angkorian and Pre-Angkorian past. It's very tricky, to do this work, although I'm more comfortable in talking about the Funan Teco Canal. So what we do, what we can say is that we're just at the very beginning of understanding how common people live. We're excavating places where people had houses, where they threw their trash. We're starting to study the pottery that they made and that they cooked in. We work with paleobotanists or archaeobotanists who study the plant seeds that are left. Pollen that's there tells us what they were eating and what kinds of plants they grew. So this work has been helpful in Angkor in suggesting that even in the areas around Angkor Wat where we excavated within the residential enclosures, that people were living their lives. We have cotton, we have mung beans, we have evidence of food, we have evidence people were probably weaving or using cloth. But it's at the very beginning stages, and if looking at sacralizing water is difficult, it's even more difficult to do this. But what we're hoping, working with a big team, is that in the next 10 or 15 years, we'll be able to talk more about the daily lives. All we've been able to do so far, and I was not the lead here, Sarah Klassen published an article with lots of us back in 2021 that was just estimating the number of people who lived there. It takes years and years and dozens or hundreds of people working to try to understand, but we're trying to bring in the skills and expertise of people who do everything from studying plants to looking at the residue that's inside pots that people use, right? To try to understand what the quotidian life is like. It's very rare that people, archaeologists, can excavate a site and find, say, an elite woman, as they did in Hunan province in China with this Ma Wingwei burial. I happened to see the museum, and they have everything there from this woman, including parts of her innards. You know, that's very rare that you have that kind of preservation. We don't have that here, and so it's a kind of mystery work where we have to say, well, there's this line of evidence, and there's this line of evidence, and if you look at the recipe of the cooking pot, we think maybe there were potters who were working locally, or they were getting their pots from somewhere else. So it's very small steps we have to take with many different people doing extremely tedious work, which I guess is the basis of science, for us to talk about it. But we're trying, and I appreciate that you asked.
Thank you.
I just wondered about how smaller countries are looking at the relationship between animals and people, and we did mention maybe something looking at animal bones earlier on. Oh, can I be intrigued by elephants and what about the working animals, sort of the research and college and all of that?
Yeah. Oh yeah, well, who doesn't love elephants? Well, so to start with, again, we're at the beginning of this. I don't know how to say this and have this come across the right way. The tradition of archaeology here in Cambodia, until recently, and with very few exceptions, until the 1990s and the 2000s, was archaeology that was done in the service of understanding architecture. There was a French tradition. There are French prehistorians who are among the best in the world, but only a couple of them had worked here. One very important person was Roland Morer. He worked at Laos and and there were some other archaeologists who worked. To the best of my knowledge, no one looked at animal bones. Sorry, he looked at a few animal bones. So the idea of excavating animal bones from archaeological sites is new. We're doing it. There are archaeologists from Cambodia that I've worked with for the last 24 years who are experts in studying animal bones, like Gun Wuti. So to begin with, sometimes we find them and sometimes we don't. Weird fact, we excavated at Angkor Wat 3 different times and never found animal bones, right, Rachna? We didn't find animal bones. What's that about? Were they vegetarian? Is it the soils? No animal bones. But if we excavate outside of Angkor Wat enclosure, we find animal bones. And in Battambang, we got plenty of animal bones. At Angkor Wat, we got boatloads of bones. Bagloads of animal bones, right? So for starters, you don't always get animal bones. Secondly, you have to figure out what people are eating. So we're doing more of that, although it would be wonderful if we had very early deposits and we could look at domestication. We are interested in the extent to which people are hunting. So for example, in Battambang, where we work at Pasat site, it looks like there's a lot more deer, and people are managing, I don't know if they're managing, but they're extracting forest resources, whereas at Angkor Wat, it's more domesticated resources so far. there's that piece. I should also point out, though, that there are people working on aspects of animals that are not archaeological studies. Zeb Hogan has been working on big fish in the Mekong for a long time, which is really great. So there are zoologists, I think he'd call himself that, who work on it. We're just starting, although archaeologists, we are very susceptible to trends, and so first we're interested in multi-species interactions. But we first have to find out what the species were. And then finally, did you mention bees, Penny? Yeah, so it turns out there are inscriptions that mention bees in the Delta. And P-Paul May, in his article, and in his chapter, in the Angkorian World Book, talks about it, right? So we're starting to look at animals. We're starting to see them in inscriptions. Sorry, there are some other examples. There's a student who finished at SOAS, Pungara. He also looked at animals, right? Didn't he do that in his thesis? I think he also, I believe he looked at animals. So people are starting to try to look at iconography and look at animals, to look at animal bones, and also to understand relationships today with animals, which is great. We haven't found a lot of dog. I'm sorry, I know. We have a little bit, but we don't have a lot yet. And then for people like me, we're all obsessed with the coupre. Who doesn't love the coupre, right? And so there's all these things, and then you wonder, well, elephants. Yeah, there are a lot of good questions. The best question, which we haven't been able to answer, in my opinion, if you could distinguish Bos indicus, which is the zebu, humped cattle, from Cambodian, well, Southeast Asian cattle, Banteng, and so on. It would be really interesting to see the earliest appearance of Bos indicus, because it would be, to me, a very good kind of evidence of contact with South Asia. The same way as when we find mung beans in archaeological sites in peninsular Thailand, because they're not endemic to Southeast Asia. They come from South Asia. So I would like to see that. There's a lot of work to be done, for sure.
I myself have a question.
Oh no!
I will take this opportunity because I'm intrigued by the way the ways in which you bring in the conversation between the past and the present, even the distant past of prehistory. I was wondering if you ever had a chance to perhaps, oversee an archaeological site and of prehistory, perhaps, and suddenly, among your teams, discover the human remains of the, 50 years also, the remnants of war in the Mekong, and how can you deal with that? How do archaeologists deal with that? Have you ever had a chance to, to the need to recruit the forensic experts who work with the archaeologists? How do the archaeologists deal with these issues?
We run away. I have excavated a cemetery, but the cemetery is 2,200 years old. Right, so there's several pieces. First of all, several archaeological projects have focused on cemeteries. Sometimes that's because ancient cemeteries are getting looted, especially in Bantu Che. We have a very bad problem there because cemeteries, people were buried with grave goods, and those grave goods are valuable for art collectors in the Western world, and so there's been that. We have not done any forensic work. That's another project I'm on. Works with people who do specifically recover forensic remains, but that's not what archaeologists generally do. And the only times we run into potential recent burials, we stop. If you excavate in a pagoda, you may run into it. A lot of we got just very close. They weren't humans, but there were areas we decided to stop working because they had been used for interring humans for a period of time. So out of deference to the pagoda, they said we could work there, but once we found that evidence, we stopped. You've asked a lot of different questions tonight.
Perhaps if some of us has a very last question.
I think they're ready for the food.
Yes, because you ended with the food in the previous conversation. With that, I would like to thank Professor William Stark for your time and insightful talk, and making this evening speech special for everyone to see the presence of scholars, students, and those who are interested in this talk and more the Mekong region as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.